So I'm outside the Scout Hall, it's blowing a hoolie. We were supposed to be looking at more bikes this week, but we're not because it's windy. I was up speaking to Lewis outside his workshop earlier on today and we heard an almighty crack and a branch had fallen off one of the trees outside the shops there. There was a guy walking on the path. He got a real fright. We could see he was quite startled. We were quite startled. I mean, it missed us by meters. About 30 meters, but it was still close. It's dangerous. It's very dangerous. So we're in the hall, the Scout Hall, and what I've done is I have set up our firing range, which you can see behind us. Now, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're not going to be so much firing the air rifles, air guns, just talking about safety a wee bit and operation, how they work. Because I appreciate in the last video we shot a potato quite often. The potato didn't survive, but we didn't talk about how the guns worked. So there's all sorts of different types of air rifles, air pistols you can buy. They do all sorts of different things. There's different sizes of ammunition that fire through them and different ways that happens. So we're going to look at that. We're also going to look at how we set the range up to make sure that it's safe. Going to look at the targets, the kind of targets that we use, and we may even have a demonstration of some secret powder that goes pop. It's just the urinals flushing. Classy, very classy. Okay, so the first thing to consider when we're talking about air rifles, air pistols, are they firearms? Well, according to Scottish law, they're called firearms, but in the dictionary sense of the word, they're not firearms. Air guns use compressed air or compressed gas to propel the projectile down range. It doesn't use any sort of chemical reaction, any ignition to do it. So technically they're not firearms, but for the purposes of the legal system, they do call them firearms. Certainly they are as dangerous as firearms. We said that an air gun uses some form of compressed gas to propel the pellet down the range, and I'm going to demonstrate. I've brought my syringe. I'm not a drug addict. I have this for draining the brake fluid out of my motorcycles. Honestly, it's totally true. So we have our air gun. What we're going to do is we're going to cock it. Now you need to imagine that there's a spring behind here, so we're going to cock it by moving the spring, compressing the spring all the way back and creating a void in here, in the chamber if you like. And then once we've done that, we're going to load our ammunition into our barrel. So that goes in like this. Now, this is now ready to fire. This particular air gun doesn't have a safety catch. What we're going to do is we're going to pull the trigger, and you may not see this because... So, obviously, it's no longer in the barrel. Went away down there. That is a bullseye. Totally a bullseye. Okay, so that's our air gun. And now we're going to do a quick demonstration of a firearm. A firearm uses a chemical reaction to ignite and cause a substance to expand at a tremendous rate, thus propelling the projectile, the bullet, out of the gun, down the barrel and down the range. So what we've got is a demonstration of that here. So this is just a tiny wee amount of the magic secret mixture in the pan here. This is our firing pin. This is our round. This is our, well, it's a Le Creuset frying pan, I can't lie. So let's see if we can get this to go off. You don't really get an idea of how loud that is because the camera, it flattens it all out. You can see there that all we really did was we just put a wee bit of pressure on the material in the tin foil and off it went. The noise and the flash is just the chemicals reacting and expanding at an exponential rate. And it is a tiny wee chemical explosion which propels real bullets towards their intended target, for better or for worse. Now, although that is a lot more powerful than an air rifle or an air pistol, an air rifle or an air pistol will do just as much harm. So we always need to be mindful of that. It's a worry that you can just do that with stuff you might have, you know, under the sink. The next thing is you need a licence to have them. This is a moderately new thing in Scotland. You don't need a licence in England. In Scotland you do. You need to be over 18 to buy one. You can't buy one for someone who's under 18. So I have a licence. I'm going to cover up my... And they actually gave me a licence and I sent them that photo. So really anyone can get a licence. I mean, look at that. Who'd give him a licence to have air guns? Also, and I have this purely for scouts because it's what they require, I have a range conducting officer's qualification, which means that I can run a range for scouts. What do we fire through air guns? We fire pellets through them. We either fire 2.2 pellets or we fire 177 pellet. A 2.2 pellet, which you probably won't be able to see because it's too small, tiny wee thing there. Tiny wee 2.2 pellet. And a 177 pellet. The 2.2 pellet, 5.5 millimetres. 177 pellet, 4.5 millimetres. It's 0.177th of an inch, 0.22 of an inch. That's what that means. The other ammunition that we occasionally fire are BBs. BBs usually get shot through a smoothbore gun. The barrels are not rifles, so they tend to go all over the place. You don't need a licence to have a BB gun. They are still dangerous. You can still blind someone with a BB gun. You need to be careful. And also, if you're out and about and someone sees you with a BB gun, some of which look quite realistic, could get into trouble. So, not toys. So, what's the difference between a 177 and a 2.2? A 177 rifle will have a flatter trajectory. The pellet will travel more quickly. A 2.2 rifle tends to have an arced trajectory when it's flying through the air. That's what trajectory means. And doesn't travel quite as quickly. However, a 2.2 pellet, when it gets to its target, will do slightly more damage if it's further away. Because the 177 pellet is travelling that much more quickly, it'll do more harm, but it needs to be closer to you, or so I read. I always thought a 2.2 pellet would do more harm because it's bigger, but no, kinetic energy is important. Something with a lot of kinetic energy will do a lot more damage. A 177 rifle is fine for plinking. It's also more accurate at 10 metres. We run a range here that's roughly 10 metres, depending if we get the tables right. So at 10 metres, with that flat trajectory, when it goes in a straight line, the 177 rifle is probably going to do better than a 2.2, which is going to arc up and then come back down and drop back down. But it doesn't drop back down until way down there. See, if you are hunting and you're ratting or you're like shooting rabbits, and then fair enough, you might want a bigger pellet to get closer to your target so you can blast it to smithereens, but it's not what we do, so nah, not interested in shooting bunnies. I don't want to shoot a bunny. First type of air rifle is a Springer. Looks a bit like this. Springers tend to be break barrels. Sometimes you get a lever underneath the barrel stays fixed, and you cock it that way. All you're doing, in the body of the gun there is a chamber that has a piston in it with a spring behind that. When you cock the gun, that's when you pull to cock the spring back, you're locking the spring back in the chamber, and then when you pull the trigger, it releases the spring, compresses the air in the chamber, fires the pellet. Next up is our CO2 powered rifle. These take small 12 gram canisters of carbon dioxide gas. They drop into the gun, the end is pierced. And each time you pull the trigger, a measured amount of carbon dioxide is released from this canister. Under pressure, behind the pellet, fires it out. It's about a quarter to a third of the power of a Springer air rifle. Those Springer air rifles that I've got are full power, 12 foot-pounds, that's how it's measured. Our second CO2 powered rifle is this. It's a slightly more serious affair. It's not a gun I've ever shot. It was donated by a chap at the rifle club that I go to, the rifle club that I got the range conducting officer's qualification from. Instead of the small 12-gram these cylinders of carbon dioxide CO2, it takes a much bigger container of CO2. This is an 88-gram container of CO2. Interesting things about this is that obviously it's a fixed barrel. It has a cocking mechanism here, a bolt action cocking mechanism, which is how you load. Came with a scope, and it also has a suppressor. This is a green gas powered BB gun. The foot-pound coming out of this is probably less than one. It uses the BBs. The barrel is not rifled, they just go all over the place. It has a reservoir that you charge up at the bottom there. There's also a magazine there for your BBs to go in. It has a blue slide at the top there to make it look so that it can't be confused as for a real gun. You would have trouble maybe holding a post office up with that. Well, no, don't do that. So a PCP air rifle with its tank, its pre-charged tank of compressed air, will fill to something in the region of 3000 psi. That's a lot more than a car tyre. I filled topped up my car tyres earlier on today and filled them to about 40 psi. So 40 versus 3000 is a big jump. Why is it as high as that? Well, it's not just the power to push the pellet out, it's the number of pellets it can fire as well. It depends on the size of the tank on the gun. Different guns have different size tanks. A bigger tank you're going to get more shots out of. I don't own one, so I don't know, but I'm fairly sure that you can attach a compressor directly to the gun and pump it up. I know you can get hand pumps to pump your gun up. However, normally what you do is you take your diver's air bottle to a dive shop and get it filled, and then you can fill your gun from that any number of times. It depends on the size of the bottle you've got. Equally, you can just buy a compressor, but they're super expensive because of the PSI that you need to get your gun to. I've got a compressor in my house for doing car tyres, and it will only maybe 60 psi maximum. It won't go beyond that, so it's not enough to fill any PCP air rifle. So what's the difference between a PCP or a CO2 charged gun and a Springer? Basically, a Springer, when you pull the trigger, there's a lot more going on in the body of the gun. You've got a spring that's locked back. When you pull the trigger, it slams forward, compressing the air in the cylinder, firing the pellet out. So that causes the gun to move. On a PCP rifle or a CO2 rifle, it's just the trigger pull. So technically, the CO2 guns could be more accurate. However, because they're not as powerful, it's a trade-off. A PCP, an expensive PCP air rifle, is going to be an awful lot more accurate than a Springer like this. It just is. And you would expect that because they're about 4 or 5 times the price. So the most important thing when we're shooting in the hall is safety. So we have a very strict setup when we operate our range. The rules are non-negotiable. I'm not going to go over them now. I'm just going to very quickly point out the salient important points of a range. At the top of the range, you have a firing point. Our firing point is the place where shooters sit, stand or lie when they're shooting. No one else can be on the firing point when it's live. The range conducting officer will say when the range is live, and when that is the case, the only people that should be on it are the range conducting officer and the people who are shooting. So at the other end of our range, from our shooting point, we have our target area. Now, currently I've got this set up for 2 shooters, just because, well, it's just me. There's not going to be anyone else here. So behind me we have our targets. We have our pellet catchers for target shooting. We've got spinner targets down here on the table for plinking and for fun, and a dueling post at the end here. The most important thing about any range is an effective backstop. And as you can see behind our pellet catchers, we have some heavy duty ground sheets. These are enough to stop a pellet quite easily. The most powerful gun I have is a 177 and it won't go through that. Behind our pellet catcher we have our secondary backstop. This is the same material that airbags are made out of, and believe it or not, although it's quite thin, it does stop pellets. You can see the marks on the material where pellets have impacted and they don't go through. The reason I don't just run with that is because if you're shooting at the pellet catchers, there is a concentration of shots in this area, and eventually the material of this backstop will weaken and the pellets will begin to go through. So that's why we've got this heavy duty ground sheet material here. Range is live, not that there's anyone here. 2-2 pellet going in to there, all the way forward. So I'm just going to see what happens. This is actually similar in design to a PCP rifle. It's just that it's got this disposable tank at the front. On a PCP rifle, looks similar to this, maybe a bigger tank. This would be refillable and it would have a valve that you connected in and recharge from your diver's bottle or your compressor. We'll talk about how you hold the rifle and shooting positions. On this shooting range as we have it, you will always be shooting from a seated position. The trick is to get the gun as still as possible in the run up to firing it. Now, I am no expert on this. From what I've picked up from the target shooting club that I go to occasionally on a Wednesday, you've got 3 points of contact that you need to remember when you're shooting. It's your shoulder, the stock against your shoulder, your elbow on the table, and your hand on the gun further down. This is a steadying hand and used to pull the trigger, okay? If you can get both elbows on the table, then fair enough. The idea is to lock this triangle into position. Don't hold it tight, otherwise you'll start to shake. Just hold it lightly, but you really want to lock this triangular shape. Once you're ready to fire, pellet goes in the chamber a wee bit, and then you're ready to, so there we have it. So when you're going to fire, you've got your position and you're comfortable. Your next thing to think about is your breathing. Now, at the rifle club, and I would have to defer to their judgment because they're very good at it. As I say, I'm no expert, but what they tend to do is get very, very still. They shoot 10 targets and they come out with their targets and it's 10 bullseyes at 25 metres or yards. It makes no never mind because they come out and their target. I can't even get a bullseye in there. I've never had a bullseye. Oh, I have. It was a fluke. So the point is to get your breathing very steady. Now, what they do is they breathe all the way out, hold it all the way out, then squeeze the trigger. I tend not to do that. I tend to shoot a lot more quickly than that, which is why I'm crap at it probably. When I breathe out, I really want just to breathe in again, otherwise I'll suffocate. So I try and time it so that I fire, I squeeze the trigger when I'm all the way breathed out, and just before I start to breathe in again. When you breathe, your body moves, and the whole point of shooting is to pull the trigger when your body is at its most still. So I breathe all the way out, and then I squeeze the trigger. That's what we're going to talk about next, is the trigger. You're not pulling the trigger. We always say pulling the trigger, but you're not. I tend to think of it as moving the trigger, because if you pull the trigger, the temptation is you yank it and it pulls the gun off. And a tiny deviation at the end of the barrel there is a huge deviation when it comes to the bottom of the range and what you're shooting at. So what you're doing is you're squeezing the trigger until the gun goes off. Very slowly, moving the trigger back, slowly, 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 until the gun goes off. Some guns have a two-stage trigger, so there's a bit of give, and you pull, and then you get a bit of pressure, and then the gun will go off. And it's a way of knowing with some uniformity when the trigger is going to set the gun off. Cheaper guns don't have that. This is a medium sort of gun. Let me just check. So, steady my breathing. Safety's off, fingers on the trigger. Not a two-stage trigger, but quite smooth. The thing is, I'm squeezing the trigger, I'm moving it back towards my body, I'm not pulling it and pulling the gun off. Everything has to be gentle and controlled. I fired a Springer and I fired the big CO2 rifle. I can see the big CO2 rifle is a lot older, so possibly not as accurate for that purpose. And remember what we said about 177s being more accurate than 22s. 22s have that natural arc, they come up and then come back down again. The trajectory of a 177 is flatter, it travels a far straighter path as it cuts through the air. It's safe to say that a PCP rifle would be more accurate. When you pull the trigger, it just goes off. There's no cylinder with a spring slamming forward into it to fire the pellet out. It's just a pht, and the pellet goes out. It's really smooth. In some regards, it's actually a wee bit disconcerting because you don't really know that the gun's, well, you know it's gone off because you heard it, but there's no movement. So that can be a bit disconcerting if you're not used to it. Never having fired an 88 gram CO2 canister powered rifle, I think it is more powerful. I think it's a lot more powerful than the wee 12 gram capsule. There we have it, PCP air rifles, Springer air rifles, CO2 air rifles. Need to be very careful with them, they're not toys, okay? They are dangerous. However, I think we've had a good test there, fired that big CO2 powered rifle. I'd say that's close to full power, not maximum power, but certainly enough to be getting on with. And not an expensive CO2 powered rifle, but very smooth. None of the movement when you fire a spring-powered air rifle, you get that movement in the gun. You just know you've fired it when you pull the trigger. The CO2 rifle, a lot smoother. Next week, weather permitting, we'll be on motorbikes, looking at engines, wheels, tyres, exhausts, learning how to look after our cars. Your cars will probably all be electric when you're adults, so I don't know why I'm bothered, to be honest.